Good afternoon and welcome to the keynote presentation of this afternoon by Dr. Robert Twiley
Estatal de Luisiana.
from the State
Me voy a permitir
University of
leer
Louisiana.
su
I
biografía.
will read his resume. El doctor Robert Twiley ha sido un profesor distinguido en el Departamento de Oceanografía y Ciencias de la Costera. Ha dado clases
2004 and served in several administrative capacities, including Executive Director of Louisiana Sea Grant College Program, Associate Vice Chancellor of Research and Economic Development, and Director of Wetland Biogeochemistry Institute. Dr. Twiley founded the LSU Coastal Sustainability Studio in 2009. During his tenure at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, Robert served as Vice President of Research, was a distinguished professor in biology department, and developed the UL Lafayette Center for Ecology and Environmental Technology in 1999. He served as president of Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation in 2017 to 2019 and was recipient of the National Wetlands Award in Science Research by the Environmental Law Institute in 2017. He's a leading national expert in coastal deltaic science and sustainability. He has worked on some of the largest ecosystem restoration efforts in the world, including the Mississippi River Delta, Chesapeake Bay, Florida Everglades, and mangrove conservation and restoration throughout the neotropics of Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and Mexico. He has published several extensively on coastal ecology scientific papers on mangrove ecosystems, global climate change, and has been involved in developing ecosystem models coupled with engineering designs to forecast the rehabilitation of coastal and wetland ecosystems. Robert also served the state of Louisiana in several capacities as science advisor to coastal restoration planning projects, including Louisiana Coastal Area, the LCA plan in 2007 and 2012, Louisiana Coastal Master Plans, and regional planning following Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, known as Louisiana Speaks. He has testified in several U.S. House and Senate subcommittees hearings and worked with the staff from several congressional and state subcommittees, along with briefings to several federal agencies to develop policy for coastal restoration programs. He received his bachelor and master of science from East Carolina University, PhD from University of Florida, and postdoctoral studies were at Horn Point Laboratory at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Study. It's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Robert, and the audience is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's see. I'm going to see if we can get this to share. Are you sure you want to share? Yes, I haven't seen that before. All right. You don't see my screen yet, right? Here we go. You should see Perfect. My screen now.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first, let me say how honored I am to be here, and it is a great pleasure to be able to give this presentation to the 5th Mexican Congress of the Mangrove Ecosystem. It was great getting an email note from Ana Laura, who asked me if I remember her, and for sure I remember my great experiences in the days in the field in Mexico and the colleagues that I've met and worked with, and experience that I had. It actually, my trips through the mangroves of Mexico were early in my career and have forever shaped my thinking about mangroves. And so it's a great honor to be here. I also just want to say a quick note to an area that I've worked in the Yucatan. And before I start, I can share with you my thoughts throughout the last several months with all the hurricanes that have been in the Gulf. And my heart goes out to those who have been impacted in Yucatan because I know it because it would hit, those hurricanes hit the Yucatan before they hit Louisiana. So we have something in common. I'm sure you are, as we are here in Louisiana, still trying to recover from a devastating week with Hurricane Zeta. So, let me start by saying that what my plan is, give you an overview of what I refer to as systems ecology of mangroves, and it will be told as a story that I plan to tell by using carbon. But I want to share with you a little bit of how I got to where I am today, a little bit of the history of why we got into carbon in mangroves back in the 70s, 1976. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the past, talk about how that shaped our thinking in the present, and why I think that the way we've developed our concepts will also be very relevant to the future. And I'm telling this story, I hope, so that the graduate students will sort of get a perspective of where we've been, and more importantly, I'm going to share with you at the end some real gaps and where I think are real exciting areas for graduate students to work on in the future. I want to acknowledge, before I start, Andre Robai, who is a postdoc, now a research scientist at LSU, who's been working with me. And we've had a lot of fun publishing some really nice papers in the last couple of years. And a lot of the work you're going to see today is from him. But I also, hopefully you see a second slide now. I also want to highlight that what you're going to see today is also efforts of a lot of people that we've been interacting with, sharing data sets, and looking at the global perspective in some of the analysis I'm going to show you that's just now coming out. In fact, we just sent the proofs of a paper that will come out pretty soon that will have much of what I'm showing you today. So let's start with a story of the past, and it starts at Rookery Bay. It's an estuary in southwest Louisiana on the Gulf of Mexico. It is, when I worked there, it was not an estuarine research reserve. The National Estuarine Research Reserve is a system of estuaries that are in a program that was established by NOAA, the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, to look at different estuaries and compare their ecology and establish long-term monitoring and education programs. Rookery Bay was, when I worked there, was a Collier County Conservancy, but now has some really nice facilities, and we still go back. In fact, I have a graduate student right now that's just finishing up a master's thesis there. And when I worked at Rookery Bay, when I started my PhD work, I want to set the context by talking about two dissertations that many of you in the mangrove community you're very aware of, and that is a dissertation by Bill Odom and a dissertation by Eric Hield. You may not be as familiar with the dissertation by Eric Hield, but these were published in 1971. They were dissertations that were in the Shark River area, North River of the Everglades, and were instrumental in establishing the importance of mangroves and supporting food webs of estuaries. And much of that significance to the food webs of estuaries was established by tracking carbon. And this is a textbook picture that I still teach using this picture of the significance of mangrove detritus and how that mangrove detritus moves throughout the food web and established the importance of mangroves to the estuary. Again, partly by documenting the flow of carbon. But there was another part that system that I just showed you, though, was focused on what we call the fringing or the rid mangroves, the mangroves that were right next to the estuary, where the leaves would fall from the canopy down into the water. These leaves were buoyant, and so they would float. And if you go on a boat ride in an estuary in a mangrove region, these rid mangrove leaves are very prominent throughout the estuary. The question was, well, what about these mangroves back in the back, these more interior mangroves? This is where the black mangroves, you can see the zonation. These are salinas. These are very high salinity areas here where no mangroves grow at all. The black mangroves are more tolerant of higher salinity and grow in the back, more inland areas, and the rid mangroves out on the fringe. But what I want you to notice in this picture is the emphasis of putting development of residential housing and recreational facilities back in these more inland mangroves, because the idea was that these mangroves contribute very little to the ecology of the estuary. And so this era of the early 70s and throughout mid 70s into 1980 was, again, a time of establishing which mangroves are important and which mangroves are not. And this paper, this letter that Bill Odom put in his dissertation clearly shows that, if before his dissertation, that most of the mangrove area was not worth preservation, as you can see in this last part of this sentence. It contributes very little to the productivity. Well, Bill Odom and Eric Hield show that that's not the case, that the rid mangroves are very important. However, the black mangroves, the mangroves back in the back, were considered wasteland. They were considered wasteland, even to the point where at Rookery Bay, when I was starting my dissertation work, there was a plan, as you can see here in these schematics, to actually build Rookery Bay towers. These were going to be a high-rise apartment, 1,366 units that were going to be built with these 300-foot-long docks and constructed, 50 feet out in the Rookery Bay Sanctuary. And the audacity to propose to build this type of development right in the middle of a sanctuary was clearly based on the fact that we will protect the rid mangroves, but we're going to build these over the black mangroves. In fact, in very documents that were written during this time, there was these consultant reports that pretty much said that, we're establishing a judgment on an ordering of ecological system values. Now think about that statement. And so, today we use this term ecosystem services. This was actually published in around 1974 is when this document, or 1973, sometime in that point of time. And they were establishing value of ecosystems based on a ranking of ecological value based on organic carbon export. Carbon exchange, carbon export was the deciding factor as to the significance of these ecological values. And black mangroves were considered that they were non-exporting mangroves, and they play an insignificant role in the estuarine ecosystem function. Very powerful statements. And of course, this flew in the, was of course part, in fact, Eric Hield consulted and participated in these reports because, he had established the value of the rid mangrove, but he actually participated in studies that, in his perspective, showed that these mangroves did not export out to the estuary. In fact, in many of the studies authored at that time consultant reports, black mangroves contribute less than 10% of the productivity to the estuary. And so you had various statements, again, that were associating value of mangroves to the dynamics of carbon. So if you ask me, what got you into the carbon game? Well, it was because there was this value proposition of mangroves that was being challenged relative to their location in the estuary. And it wasn't blue carbon. I mean, this was before carbon was blue, before global carbon budgets. This was about the value of ecosystems related to exporting carbon. And when this controversy and conflict over carbon between different types of mangroves, Ariel Lugo published this paper, a very famous paper, he and Sam Snedeker, on typologies, different classifications of mangroves. And the big question when I entered into graduate school was, what's the functional characteristics of these different types of mangroves? And you quickly, as a graduate student, gravitated to the question of, well, what is their carbon export rate? Because carbon export rate was considered very important document of that value. And so you see a copy of my dissertation on the right, published in 1982 and reports to EPA. We published a couple of, our first papers on carbon and mangroves were all focused on export and litter dynamics, because again, the litter function of mangroves was considered the way to establish ecological value. And many of these concepts ended up in textbooks and have been used. And the bottom line is that, well, in fact, black mangroves do export less than red mangroves. The interior mangroves export less than fringe mangroves. But guess what? The area of interior mangroves are 2 to 3 times the area of fringe. So when we did our ecosystem and system analysis budget of carbon in Rookery Bay, black mangroves were very significant to the organic carbon budget of these systems. Well, during this time, let's transition to the present, and let's transition to blue carbon. And where does the story go from, okay, carbon export as establishing value of mangrove ecosystems, to this concept of blue carbon establishing the value of mangrove ecosystems? And it changed the whole dynamic of the conversation, because it changed the focus not on how much carbon is exported, but to how much carbon is stored. And I started, transitioning my entire thinking on this at this one meeting in Germany that I was invited to attend. Larry Lugo was sick and could not attend, and so he asked me to go in his place. And basically, I'm showing a little poker game, because that's basically what it was. Everyone in all the different biomes around the world showed up at this beautiful hotel in Bad Hausberg, Germany. And our job was to sit around a table and develop a global carbon budget of the world. Figure out how much carbon was stored in all the biomes of the world, and how much was a carbon sequestration each year in those biomes. And the reason I put this poker picture in here is that that's what it felt like, is that each evening you had to sort of ante up your carbon to be part of the game. And trust me, there were most people at that meeting, number one, felt that wetlands should not be there because you didn't have enough carbon to really play the game. And second, particularly mangroves. Are you kidding? You people are so insignificant. You got no business in the room. But we like Ariel Lugo, and we're going to tolerate you. You can stay around and eat our food and drink our wine, but don't get too serious. And and what was really great, what was driving a lot of this was this, and that got Houghton in 2007. But Houghton had first published this perspective on carbon back in the 80s, where he asked a very simple question. which I put in this context of this little mass balance of carbon in this little cartoon, is if you take all the carbon that's generated by fossil fuel, you take all the carbon that's generated by land use, which ends up to be about 7,300 teragrams of carbon per year. Subtract from that the amount of carbon that you have that goes into the oceans, you end up with about 1,939 teragrams of carbon left over. Now, take that 1,939 teragrams of carbon and look at the CO2 increase in the atmosphere. How much carbon does it take for us to see that famous oscillation of carbon that goes up year after year after year? Well, it happens to be about 1,166 teragrams of carbon per year. It's not 1,900, which means there has to be 773 teragrams of carbon somewhere that's being sunk. There's a missing estimate of what is the total carbon sink in the world. And of course, the question at the table each evening is, where is that carbon? Where is that carbon sink? Where is the missing carbon sink? And so everybody is scurrying to the poker table to count up their carbon. And of course, I was right there with my elbows, making sure we were at the table to talk about mangroves and wetlands globally. So that got me into the carbon game. That got me into the carbon sequestration, carbon sink. It completely changed my whole thinking of of mangrove carbon dynamics from what was exported, what was going out into the estuary, to what's in the forest. And fundamentally, when I switched those gears, I gravitated to this paper and figure number one of this paper by Lugo and Snedeker. And I've stuck with it my entire career. And this basic little sentence right here, it says the basic mangrove ecosystem is depicted as two coupled storages, above ground structure and muds, linked by cycling of matter and powered by the interaction of sunlight and matter through photosynthesis. And so, I focused on trees and mud, and that became pretty much the rest of my career. And taking what existed at that time, a pretty limited literature, I went around and calculated all the wood growth and all the burial rates that we could find for mangroves, and assumed that, look, all the stuff that's fluxing across the borders, we're not going to worry about measuring that. If you want to know if there's a carbon sink in a mangrove, it's either in the wood or it's what's accumulating in the mud. And we came up with about 150 teragrams of carbon per year, and that number is going to come up here in a second, or at the end of this talk, to look at again. Now, this is a little old. I gave this part of a talk at a meeting at a mangrove conference, actually, MM4, I believe, and I haven't updated this graph, but I want to make a point here that carbon budget we did and published in 1992 has some historical significance against the backdrop of the tremendous interest in carbon in mangroves. What you see here is just a simple graph of the number of publications per year. If you type in the Web of Science, just type in mangroves and carbon, right, and do a search, you'll get the number of publications that these two words resonate. And right now, well, in 2015, there were about 175 publications per year. Our publication is right there in blue. When we published our paper at Mass Balance, there were about 20 papers total in the world on mangroves and carbon. And so my point of this is, from this point on in this seminar, I want you to realize and appreciate the struggle that we had in coming up with a global carbon budget with a very limited literature, but how exciting it is today, because I have watched this topic grow to this level where, the literature, when we sit down, and the budgets that I'm going to show you and the numbers that I'm going to show you, is quite spectacular. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is be a little more strategic on where our numbers come, where we focus our numbers in the future. Now, about the time this turning in my career relative to this meeting in Germany was a meeting in Chapel Hill for the 65th birthday of H.T. Odom in 1989. And this is a picture of the group. And one of the outcomes of that meeting was a chance for people to step up and say, you know, would you like to publish a chapter in a book in honor of Odom? And I was, you know, thinking through at that point, you know, we hadn't published yet, but we had finished the carbon budget and finished traveling. I traveled quite a bit. Actually, I've been down to Mexico and traveled around some locations in Africa and seeing different mangrove sites. And what I worked on was a concept that Odom was pushed and really strongly as a concept for us to organize our thinking about ecosystems, and it was called the energy signature concept. And at that time, I had also read Bruce Tom's work. I had also actually been down in Belize with Colin Woodruff, who were two geomorphologists who had clearly established, you know, this idea of grouping mangroves by geomorphology. And so the question I had was, okay, do ecological features follow this classification? And we came up with this ecogeomorphology and this hierarchy, this diagram, a little bit different than what you see here that's actually in the book. But this hierarchy approach to understanding what patterns you see in mangroves across the world was established in 1995 in this chapter. And as you're going to see through this presentation, I have stuck with this throughout my career, and it has really helped me think. And so what I've done is take this idea and apply it to this idea of carbon, the function of mangroves related to carbon dynamics, and particularly carbon storage. And we published this paper a couple of years ago in Frontiers of Ecology and Environment. And we elevated this idea of this question of, can you explain carbon dynamics and carbon storage in mangroves across these very specific geomorphic zones, or as we call them, coastal environmental settings? And ask the question, coastal morphology explains global blue carbon distributions. And our ability to do this was, again, fundamentally based on the idea of summing up what's in the above ground and what's in the soil, and that gives you what we call ecosystem level carbon stocks. And so that we have not fundamentally moved away from that approach. But what changed the game, what completely changed the game, is the fact that while we were collecting literature and we were collecting literature and putting the carbon numbers into these different functional groups of large rivers and small deltas and tidal systems and lagoons versus carbonates, there's a paper that came out in 2011 by Durr et al., which was the first global classification of all the coastal landscapes in the world. And what we could do then was take our data set, as you can see, I'm showing the pointer here for Brazil, and we could take a data set, say, from Brazil at this location, and we could apply it to a coastal setting that had been identified by Durr. So what you see here, like this red here, are all tidal systems. You can see the carbonate in purple here in the Caribbean, and the lagoons, here are the lagoons in Mexico. And so by taking a site and using Durr's classification, we could put the data that had been collected at that site into a various geomorphic or coastal environmental setting. So the point I want to make here is that why this was so earth-breaking for us is that we had tried to do this as ecologists and say, okay, this geomorphic zone is this landscape, or this coast belongs in this geomorphic classification, this belongs in this. And it was just chaos because we're ecologists, we're not trained geomorphologists. And so this gave us an independent approach to putting numbers into these classes, and this is what we came up with. Very clear that the soil organic carbon density in milligrams per cubic centimeter had a very clear pattern across these different environmental settings. And the lowest carbon was in large rivers in the soil, and the highest was actually in these carbonate settings, which when you think about it makes a lot of sense, because deltas are mineral deposition, and it gets mixed up with the, remember, this is density of carbon per cubic volume. And so it's not, I mean, when you look at these numbers, it just makes all the sense because of the mineral deposition that dominates the soil development and deltas, whereas in carbonate, you take a core in a carbonate system, it's all roots. It's all plant material. So you get very high carbon density numbers. And so here are the results using Durer's classification. We then took Durer's classification and used it to also break it out into Bruce Tom's classification from his beautiful 1982 paper, actually the sites there in Mexico. And from that work and research in Mexico, developed a beautiful set of table that talks about how the ecological function of mangroves may vary with geomorphic setting. And sure enough, we get a pattern of carbon density in those systems as well. Well, here's another aspect of that paper by Durer that gave us a capability that we've never really had quantitative evaluations of, and that is, well, how are the mangrove areas distributed across these typologies? And sure enough, look at this. The tidal systems well dominate the total area of mangroves, almost 50,000 square kilometers. Second to that are small deltas, and then following that are lagoons, followed by carbonate, and then large delta systems. What you see here are distinctions between, this is the old world tropics, or the Indo-Pacific tropics, and this is the amount of area in the Atlantic, or the neotropics. And so now we could actually take this information with the carbon density numbers that we have and start generating total global carbon budgets. So this methodology, and which we published again as Frontiers in Ecology and Environment in 2018, really helped solidify an approach that we had written, or I had published back in 1995, and had thought about actually back in the days I was sitting around the poker table in Germany. And what you see is by area, what's fascinating is that carbonates, have this area, but when you add the higher density of carbon, you get a little bit bump in what carbonate systems contribute to the global carbon budget, as well as this new one called a REIC, these carbonate and lagoon systems. This is lagoon. I'm sorry, the green is lagoon. And the carbonate, and these carbonate systems, which we've seen. In fact, I saw Ika Feller was one of your speakers, has certainly helped us understand these carbonate mangroves, but become pretty significant. So then we wanted to go one step farther, and we talked about this. It was sort of the premise of this book that Victor Rivera took the lead on, put together, and that was not only to look at these characteristics across these coastal environmental settings, but to look at these tropical regions and these two biogeographic regions. Is there a distinction in carbon and karstic or carbon and delta environments between the Indo-West Pacific versus the Atlantic Eastern Pacific? We know species composition is different. We know, that the zonation and some of the other patterns are distinct. But when it really boils down to it, if you've got a certain tidal range and a sediment input, does that species variation really differ? I got a slide here that more clearly asks the question, whether the diversity is shown here, and many of you know this slide already. This is mangrove species richness in the Indo-West Pacific and compared to the species diversity in the Atlantic. And so we asked ourselves, does the diversity in tree life forms between IWP and AMP provinces or coastal morphologies influence carbon storage in mangrove biomass or soils? And we wanted to test this at this global scale. Now, again, you can do that now because we have someone who has classified the coastal types, and there are a lot of people that are redoing this analysis using different techniques, and I look forward to seeing those outcomes. But still, because there's Durer's technique is not as close a resolution as I know a lot of us would like to see, but still it's very helpful. But not only do we have a classification of these coasts in both the New World and Old World tropics, look at the number of observations. 1,200 observations in AEP. This is just for above ground biomass. 1,200 observations in AEP and over 1,200 in IWP. That's 24. That's we're getting up to 3,000 observations. I don't think I said it. I had it on a map. I didn't emphasize it. This is a good time to emphasize it again. We had 260 sites in our 1992 analysis, 260. And now we're looking at 3,000. And here's a distribution of above ground biomass across the globe and our ability to test these hypotheses. And again, remember we had 260 sites in 1992. And what's important, and this is for students, I'm going to come back to this because this is something for you to think about, and major professors and people who are leaders in where you set up your mangrove sites and how you establish your mangrove program. And I'll go ahead and make a point here. I'm going to make it again and over again. Mexico has every one of these environmental settings. It is one of between the Pacific and the Atlantic, one of the best laboratories for mangrove ecology. And so, but what we did here was here are the number of observations distributed between tidal systems, lagoons, and carbonate and ureic and large rivers, and both the Atlantic and the Indo-West Pacific. Look, most of the observations are tidal systems. This is where we go to set up our plots. Now, what's interesting is for those of us working in the neotropics, we like to put our plots in lagoons. If you're over in the Indo-West, you like to put your plots in small deltas. We're both gravitated to putting our research plots in tidal systems. But what gets ignored is, and it's very important, what gets ignored is particularly in the Indo-West Pacific, what gets ignored are these lagoons. And what gets ignored over in our part of the world are small deltas. And we do have a pretty good number of carbonate systems. So what's important here is looking at, I'll come back to it later. It's looking at the total area of mangroves. I think I have it right here. I'm sorry. Look at the area of mangroves. Look, for example, small deltas. Small deltas are a pretty significant area in our part of the world, in the Atlantic, but we really don't study them. Lagoons are pretty significant over in the Indo-West. They don't study them. Carbonate gets pretty good coverage in the both in the West and in the East, but still, we need to do a better job of covering those systems in the regions as well. So, and when we did this analysis, we looked at by country, what different values in woody biomass or soil organic sequestration. We looked at above ground biomass, distribution of below ground biomass, and distribution of soil organic carbon density studies in each country, so that we could look again to see where the gaps. And so we were looking for, where these observations are related to the distribution of these different environments in both the Old World and New World tropics. So let's look at some numbers. So remember, we're asking the question: Atlantic versus the Indo-West Pacific, East and West. And so basal area probably doesn't surprise you that you look at all the data. There's 1,300 observations in one, and look at the evenness of the observations between these two biogeographic areas. Quite amazing. And the basal area is a little bit higher in the Indo-West compared to the Atlantic. The height is a little bit on the average higher. These are significant differences, A and B. Lower height in the Atlantic compared to Indo-West Pacific. And thus, it doesn't surprise you that the biomass, this is per hectare, per unit area, is a little bit higher, significantly higher in the Indo-West Pacific than it is in the Atlantic East. But when you look at the soil organic carbon, it's actually, the density of carbon is actually higher in the Atlantic than it is in the West, in the Indo-West Pacific. But again, that shouldn't surprise you when you go back and look at the sites that have been selected, most common in these two regions. And in our region, in Atlantic East Pacific, we've gravitated to these carbonate lagoon small deltas systems, or mainly, tidal lagoon and carbonate systems. We've ignored the delta systems, both small and large, whereas in the Indo-West Pacific, they really focus on small deltas and tidal systems. That completely dominates their observations. And that's where your mineral sediment, right, in the soils, you get a lower density of carbon in those sites than what you find in more biomass driven soil systems, such as in carbonate and lagoon mangroves. And there's some interesting things, and then when you start separating out, the above ground biomass across environmental settings in the Atlantic East Pacific compared to the West Pacific, you get a few very interesting observations, one of which is that the more sediment rich, then the higher the biomass. Doesn't surprise, I think, many of us. But what is quite fascinating in both the West Pacific and the Atlantic East Pacific is the role of these carbonate systems, how high these values are. In fact, in the Atlantic, they're as high as tidal systems, and carbonate are very similar. And you find the same thing in the Indo-West Pacific. And what the reason for this in the West Pacific, these high values, is particularly these fringing oceanic high islands on Holocene reef tops. And even in the Everglades, you have to think about Shark River has really high biomass, 20-meter tall trees. It's sitting on a carbonate, peat on a carbonate, but it gets these phosphorus inputs from hurricanes. So you've got these really productive systems that sit on these carbonate reef environments. You go to Micronesia, 4 meters of rainfall, this tremendous amount of phosphorus that comes down from those high islands, and you get trees that are, 30, 40 meters tall. Now, let's switch gears a little bit, because now what we're going to do is we're going to take all those observations, and remember, there's a bias because of where we like to go set up our plots. Don't necessarily represent the actual area of those types of mangroves in those biogeographic regions. And so how can you take that bias out? Well, one way you can do it is you can build models based on the observations, and then you expand that model over. And if your model is based on these biogeographic regions, then you can start simulating the total amount of carbon in these settings based on these input functions. So that's what you're looking at here. Now you're looking at data, not observations, but not observation-based, but modeling-based. These are observations based on our models. And the carbon biomass across these environmental settings, this is both Old World and New World mangroves. You can see it runs right around 50 megagrams per hectare, whereas in the soil, most of the carbon, even across all environmental settings, is 200 to 350 megagrams of carbon per hectare. And so it's pretty, clear when you start doing ecosystem level carbon budgets, taking out the bias of where we put our plots, but look at the distribution of environmental settings across both the Old and New World sites. You get 80% of your 2.3 or 80% of your carbon, which is about 3.1 petagrams of carbon. 80% of that, or 2.3, is located in the soil. And then when you add these two together to get the total stocks, you end up with some fascinating numbers. One is that your average mean ecosystem level carbon stock is about 401 megagrams of carbon per hectare. Look at the range. The range is only from 340 to 451. Look how even, look how common these values around this 400, look how similar these values are across these very distinct large river deltas, small river deltas, tidal systems, lagoons, carbonate. They all have about the same amount of carbon. But what you're doing is you're taking the variation from the above ground and the variation from the soil and you're summing them together. And when you look at this total, it makes all the sense in the world because it fits this concept of biomass allocation. You know, in the sediment-rich systems, you see the above-ground biomass dominates the ecosystem level carbon stock. You go into these nutrient-poor or go into sites where most of the carbon investment is into foraging for nutrients. Most of that carbon is in the soil. You add them together, and then all of a sudden, both the carbonate and the deltas end up with the same number. And so this is this gives you a little bit better perspective. And we come up with an ecosystem level carbon stock of about 3.2 petagrams of carbon. And when you look at the distinction between the biogeographic areas, you do see what we expected, and that is we saw it in the biomass, most of the carbon in the soil, and a very strong, look how much more carbon there is in the Indo-West Pacific stored than there is in the Atlantic. And this is a very clear distinction. Now, let me finish up. Let me start wrapping up because I see I'm at 5:46. Let's do carbon stocks real quick. Now, I mean carbon sinks. Everything I've talked about is carbon stocks. Carbon sinks, you now have to add up what happens each year. And this is a totally different, you have to take the density or the stock and multiply it times the rate of wood growth or the rate of sediment and get the carbon sequestration rate. And if you look at all the numbers for the for carbon accumulation in the soil, you get 225. If you look at all the numbers in wood growth, you get about 300 grams of carbon per meter square per year. You add these up, you get about 525 grams of carbon per meter square per year. And what is the contribution of mangroves globally? 84 teragrams of carbon. Paper in 1992, 150. And this is, in my mind, enough carbon to play at the poker table. But this number still needs some much better improvement. Why? And let me make the comment here. Why? And I'm going to show you in a second the explanation for this. 3,000 observations for stocks. But when you start looking at the number of observations for sequestration rates, either in the wood or in the soil, less than, I mean, the numbers are just, the frequency of observations are a small percentage of what we have done with stocks. We need a massive global effort in understanding carbon sinks, or the derivative of carbon, or the way to think of it is the amount of carbon per unit area per year. So to conclude, we provide one of the largest compilations and synthesis of a mangrove biomass. We use it to estimate ecosystem level carbon stocks. We talk about the amount of carbon in above ground and which environmental settings you find that to occur, and in the soils where those environmental settings. But when you add them up, you get this convergence to 401 megagrams of carbon per hectare in response to biomass allocation strategies. About 80% of that is in the soil. And again, our estimate was a little bit lower than what was done in our 1992 analysis was 4.03 petagrams of carbon. After we add 3,000 sites, we get 3.2. I won't make any comment on that. We were pretty lucky, basically. And again, throughout my career, this coastal environmental setting framework has been a joy to work in. So let me finish up with the future. Got a couple minutes. First, I want to say that we have the analysis on the total carbon dynamics of the coastal ocean has been just a beautiful set of analyses. But let me tell you, the exchange the understanding of exchange with mangroves and those estuaries is still poorly understood. So I go right back to where I was when I was a PhD student. And while I've sunk all my career in the stocks and fluxes and the mud and the wood, we particularly dissolved our inorganic carbon. This is if we're going to play and understand this carbon budget, we still need a better understanding of this. Second is if you're really going to understand carbon budgets, and what we have not assessed in our analysis is the level of disturbance. And what we found out is that about 42%, a really nice analysis that Andre did, about 40% of the global mangroves are prone to cyclone disturbance. 58% are not. So when you start adding this dimension across those environmental settings, the question is, do you start separating out carbon stocks if you look at disturbed and non-disturbed? I think that's a fascinating question. And it's not just disturbance from cyclones, it's also land use disturbance. And then my final comment is where are these are a number of observations across the different environmental settings. And I'm just going to make a few points. This is below ground. Well, let me start here. Above ground, 80, 70 observations for these two environmental settings. Again, we have a really good distribution of observations across environmental settings for above ground biomass. Look, only 6 or 7 observations, 10 observations for this environmental setting. Look at soil organic carbon. We have pretty good 15, 20, much better analysis across environmental settings. Net primary wood production, look, 4 or 5. This is, when you start trying to do wood carbon production as a sequestration and wood growth, it's a really limited data set. It's even limited when you get into carbon accumulation rates of soil sequestration. We need a major effort we know the carbon stocks. Everybody's measuring carbon stocks. We have hundreds and hundreds of estimates of carbon stocks. What about sequestration? And so my final slide is showing you where Mexico fits in this. And so here I'm going to circle Mexico across these different parameters. This is mangrove above ground biomass. You're in the upper number of observations globally. For below ground biomass, it's green. Yeah, we got 2, and I'm sure this group I'm talking to, you should say, oh, there's a lot of observations of ours that you don't have, or our work is not well documented. I hope you say that, and I look forward to working with you to make sure we can improve on that. Soil carbon density stocks, pretty good. You're up there in the upper observations. But when you look at net woody biomass, very few. Or if you look at carbon sequestration studies, very few. And so students out there, research labs, a mangrove group like this, I think you've got a lot of, I think the sinks and the rate per year are really critical. So let me just say that, a talk like this has got so many people, that have touched it. And a lot of my colleagues from Mexico and my work early in my career in Laguna de Terminos, and it's helped shape my whole thinking, and I want to thank you, and it's been a great honor to give you a few thoughts on this, and I look forward to, hopefully with this talk, open up some doors and dig down into some of the areas of Mexico that I think really add significantly to this analysis. And so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robert, for your tremendous conference. We appreciate your time, and we have a couple questions. Let me see. First, Agustín de Jesús Bazañez is congratulations for your conference. And he's asking, mangroves, disturbed mangroves are keeping sequestering carbon in the soil and the whole organic matter around. But is this matter almost the same or is equal to the air carbon. He's saying like before, probably in I will say prehistorically or prehistory or something like that, I guess.
Yeah. So, well, there's a couple of points there. We've always had hurricanes. So I think the carbon budget of those mangroves disturbed by hurricanes, we've always had that in the same areas that we have it today. So I don't think that dynamic has changed. But Mexico and Louisiana we've lived through the hurricane season of 2020. And if the frequency of hurricanes increases with climate change, then that's going to change the dynamic of carbon storage in mangroves. I'm convinced of that. But what I'm not really clear on is whether or not a forest that's recovering from a hurricane may actually store more carbon than an old growth forest. So there might be something related to the fact that young regenerating forest from a hurricane actually is a big sink, and I don't know we know the answer to that. But my other point is that disturbance such as shrimp ponds and land use and cutting forests down, that has certainly increased, and that's very different today than it was in the last centuries, and so that's a real concern, and those areas need to be restored.
Okay, thank you. We have another one from Jonathan Ochoa. What are your thoughts about arid mangroves from the California Gulf, and if you know them?
Yeah, no, those are, some of the most fascinating numbers when we were doing our survey came in from the below ground carbon biomass of those forests is incredible. And I have been to those forests. These areic mangroves got very little attention, but the research from that area really started to establish, what people ignored. I worked in Honduras, the dry coastal lagoons of Honduras. Quite amount of below ground biomass in those forests, and so these areic dry coastal landscapes will surprise people about the amount of carbon that they store, particularly below ground. I mean, you don't see much above ground, but quite a bit below ground. And so yes, to be honest, the first numbers I saw, I didn't know whether I could believe them. I mean, it's real impressive.
Also, Jonathan is congratulating you and saying that they're going to be in contact with you in order to contribute with the database from the northeast from Mexico. They have a pretty good data, I guess.
Yeah, I would love to. A lot of those numbers we already have, but this is one thing I really hope from this conference is, I've got more time on my hands than I used to. I'm not in if you notice the pictures of all the speakers, I'm the only one that wasn't in a mangrove forest. And I had my administration suit on, and so I'm taking that off. I'm getting rid of my administration suit so I can go back in the mangrove. So send me an email.
Okay, very good. And Johnny Torres is saying, what can you say about the methods to determine underground biomass? Yeah. There is a problem with the difference in precision and the methods for measuring them.
This is a big issue, and we've had to establish our set of standards of when you see a dot on a map, what does it represent? And we ignore. There's a lot of data out there that we ignore because some data sets, they'll put every 2 centimeters, they'll put a different data point, and some cores go very deep and some cores are very shallow. And I think the chemistry of how we measure carbon, I think, is pretty good. But how we interpret depth and come up with a per unit area of carbon with variations in depth and how we slice the cores, and that's a mess. If you read, Andre does a great job. Read our supplementary material of our papers, because we spend a lot of time trying to establish these are the standards that we used. And I'd be really glad to share that and have a conversation with the group here in Mexico, because that's a big issue.
Okay, very good. And finally, well, we have another one, but what about as your experience as an advisor, and what is the lesson learned from Katrina and Louisiana? And if that is, I mean, if you are seeing the benefits now with CETA in the 2020.
Yeah, so let me that's been another major shift. And many of you who know me for over the years, when Katrina hit, I really shifted my research time to deltas and to Louisiana. I really felt bad that I didn't do as much mangrove work, but it was so important to be involved in the Louisiana post-Katrina research. Let me tell you something that I learned. I quit using the term ecosystem restoration. And I'll tell you why. Because we're not restoring ecosystems. The landscape has changed so much that we're trying to put ecosystems back. But what I'm using and what I teach, and I have a whole course that I teach on this, is called ecosystem design. And we're designing ecosystems in these landscapes under these new set of human boundaries. I mean, the way the rivers are controlled, the way that human waste is put into estuaries, the way that the human footprint is so large. What we're working on is designing ecosystems that fit in that new landscape. So I like the word ecosystem design rather than restoration, and that came about because of my work after Katrina. And I'd be glad to share more on that. That could be a whole different conference, but it's and I think about it now related to mangroves, and I will say that one of the most important projects I ever worked on that made me think through this was the restoration, the design of mangroves in the Magdalena River, the Ciénaga Grande de Santa Marta in Colombia. Yep.
Okay.
Good question. Good question.
And finally, Claudia Teuli Hernandez is saying that thank you, doctor, for your presentation. And have you ever evaluated the dynamics, the carbon dynamics in restore mangrove forest?
We have. And when I say restored, a lot of it is I go back to the work in Colombia. I haven't done it, but I've been working with students. And in fact, we published models of the rate at which the mangroves would recover in the Ciénaga Grande de Santa Marta. And there are brand new theses and dissertations that have just been published. Beautiful, beautiful pieces of work that compare our model predictions with what actually happened. So, and nature did better than our models. And so when you get the boundary conditions correct, nature has this tremendous capacity of coming back. If you get the river and sediment and the hydrology back to some level, these mangroves have extreme capacity to recover.
Okay. Finally, we appreciate your time. Again, thank you very much for this. We really think that this will evolve in further collaboration.
Yeah,
And
great.
thank you, Doctor, and thank you once again.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Ahí.
Yeah. Cocktail hour.
Cocktail hour.